Hello, my name is Russ Kitson from the University of Warwick. Along with my colleagues Rachel Greaves and Bo Kelestyn from Warwick and Richard Blackburn from the University of Leicester, we'd like to take this opportunity to tell you about some of the work we've been doing on the Black student experience at both of our institutions. So I imagine the term the leaky pipeline is familiar to most, if not all of you. But in terms of ethnicity, undergraduate chemistry student bodies are fairly diverse, particularly compared to the national demographic. But as you progress to postgraduate and all the way up to professorial level, this diversity really drops off. So, for example, Black undergraduate students are roughly around 5%, all the way up to academics 1%. But there was a recent article where we've got only one Black chemistry professor in the UK, Professor Robert McCarr from the University of Nottingham. And coupled with that, we have a distinct attainment gap whereby 81% of white students achieve a higher degree classification compared to just 68% of BAME students, and a number of really complicated factors make doing research in this area very difficult. So for some context to our research story, for some representation data from our two universities, you can see that the University of Leicester has a greater percentage of non-white and Black students across the whole institution, STEM faculty, and importantly within the chemistry department itself, which is what we wanted to have a look at. Now, if you consider how this compares to the national demographic, both of these percentages are in excess of the roughly 3% percentage of people in the UK who identify as Black. However, you've got to remember that this diversity is not homogenous across the UK. So both of these percentages could be in stark contrast if you consider a student coming from an area in the UK, which is, let's say, 99% the same ethnicity as their own, to a university where it's 7.7 or 16.9% within the department. Now, there are documented attainment gaps observed at both Warwick and at Leicester, and from conversations at the University of Warwick in the chemistry department, there was anecdotal evidence about our Black students being overrepresented in those students who disengaged from their studies. So we wanted to see, is this a real thing that's borne out in the attendance data? So we analysed all sessions which had recorded attendance back from 2014 to 2020. We found that the average total unauthorised absences was 12.1%. With non-Black students, it was 11.8%, and with Black students, it was 18.9%. We found this to be statistically significant as a difference, and we found that Black students are more likely to have a higher percentage of unauthorised absences. Worryingly, we also found that over half of our Black students exceeded this standard average unauthorised absences as well. So we can conclude from this quantitative analysis that the University of Warwick chemistry Black students are more likely to disengage from their course than non-Black students. But the key question is why? And then following on from that, what can we do to change that? Importantly, we wanted to compare this with the University of Leicester, which has a different student ethnicity profile, but a similar staff ethnicity profile to that at Warwick. So to investigate this, we undertook a qualitative methodology study. We wanted to look at the disparity of this engagement and compare to the University of Leicester. So we collected the qualitative data, lived experiences of 15 STEM Black students from both institutions via interview. For the method, we used a variation of this friendship as a method from Heron. The difference here being that the researcher was present because she was the same age range and ethnicity as the participants, whereas there is no researcher present in the original methodology. 9 questions were posed during the interviews with the researcher guiding the conversation, and these were the topics that were covered: representation, sense of belonging, student attainment, and student engagement. So if we consider representation first, the most prevalent themes were having felt represented and having a sense of community at a previous institution. Students often didn't feel represented at university, and there were several references to a lack of community. And this perhaps connects to the idea of vanity versus sanity metrics, where we might all like to talk about how diverse our departments, communities, universities, and so on are. But when it actually comes to what students perceive and how they feel, perhaps that's not really coming through. Students also mentioned that they felt pressure to represent their entire race and succeed at university, perhaps being the first from their family to go to university. And this representation was not just limited to students, but also those teaching, administering, and organising their courses. When we look at a sense of belonging, participants really felt that one of the first things they looked for was people who are like them. A lot of the time, students going away from the departments for a sense of support are more towards some of the societies, such as the African and Caribbean Society. We found there was a real reluctance from students to approach their lecturers, perhaps more so at Warwick than at Leicester, but still in both institutions. They felt that it was somewhat of the last resort, and they actively avoided the lecturer in some cases. A lot of this they put down to things like imposter syndrome, feeling that there wasn't really a sense of understanding of culture, or that they would often have to alter their appearance or modify their cultural representation in order to go and meet the lecturers. When we look at student engagement and attainment, the common themes that came out were more negative views on lectures versus small group teaching, such as tutorials, and negative views on traditional assessment methods. There was a real preference for more visual hands-on learning methods. Students often felt that they were isolated or uncomfortable, or under pressure to represent their race in sessions like tutorials. It came across that our participants felt like their attainment is capped, and perhaps they were starting at something of a disadvantage, and that had a knock-on effect that they had to work twice as hard to make up for it. And there were fears around things like prejudice, tokenism, representation beyond the university classroom as well. Things like departmental events, society events within the chemistry department as well were described as feeling too white for them to feel like they're welcome there. But perhaps they weren't provided for in various ways for these events as well. So when we compared the findings from the interviews at the University of Warwick with those from the University of Leicester, there were some differences that were seen. So the University of Warwick students generally experienced a lower sense of belonging than that from Leicester. We found that communication with staff was really heavily impacted at both institutions, but at University of Leicester they were much clearer about who they could approach for support. However, it wasn't clear whether they were more willing to do so than those students from Warwick. But generally all the other themes were in agreement across both institutions. So in conclusion, what we can see is that the University of Warwick black students are more likely to disengage from the course than non-black students, that STEM black students often do not feel represented at university when comparing it to their previous studies. Many of our participants didn't feel wholly comfortable or welcome at university. And the disengagement appears to be caused by numerous factors, including learning style, general sense of support and belonging. We found that our students are more likely to turn to their societies for support than that within a department, and there was a real reluctance to approach academics. Although we did observe some differences between the institutions with different student ethnicity demographics, it's more likely that a diverse staff body would have a much greater effect from what we learned from our participants. And so what can you take away from this? Well, our key recommendations from the study are to, first off, create more opportunities to discuss these issues and talk about how to tackle them. That's something that a lot of places are really starting to do now, but it's important that we do discuss these issues. Consider creating pairs or triads when building your groups for small group teaching. So for instance, have pairs or triads of black students so that they don't feel like they're in there isolated and having to represent their ethnic background. Of course, there's the ongoing drive towards a more ethnically diverse staff body. And then we'd encourage people to embrace more qualitative data within STEM. Certainly I'm guilty of this within too dependent on quantitative data, but there is real value and richness in the qualitative data, such as that we collected during this research project. And finally, if you'd like to read more about this study, we published a paper in the Journal of Chemical Education earlier this year. So in terms of what we'd like to do next with the study, I should go without saying that scaling up the work would be required to establish whether this is a general trend that we've seen. We'd like to look at other splits, for example, gender, home overseas. In a similar vein, we'd like to look at the student experience of those from different ethnic backgrounds as well. So, for example, Richard and I are starting a project to look at the experience of Asian background students with Dr. Namra Shahid from Durham and Dr. Nimesh Mistry from Leeds. But we'd like to further this research for our black student experience by having further comparative angles, for example, with greater non-white demographic for both staff and students, majority black ethnicity students but not staff, majority black ethnicity for both staff and students. Finally, that leads me to acknowledge those people who played key roles for this project, particularly Rachel Greaves, who ran this as a master's project a few years ago and has now gone on to a teaching career, Dr. Bo Kelestyn from the University of Warwick, Dr. Richard Blackburn from Leicester, student participants from both institutions, Professor Tina Overton, formerly of Monash and Leeds, and Dr. Chris Thompson from Monash for invaluable advice, the Warwick Department of Chemistry for funding, and finally you for your kind attention.